Good morning or afternoon, whatever it is now. I think it's right at noon. Glad that you guys made it at, what's it, 16 degrees or something outside. So thanks for showing up in these freezing temperatures. Saw many of you at NAPE, or at least a few of you at NAPE last week. I do know that one of you, Jonathan in the back, he has seen a longer version of this presentation already. So Jonathan, you can leave anytime if you want, unless you want to sit through the same thing again. This topic that I'm going to talk about today, 3 years ago, I didn't spend any time on it. I wear a legal hat about half the time. I wear an operational hat in our companies about half of the time. And we are subject to most of the rules and the requirements that I'll be talking about today within one or more of our companies. We're subject to either Quad O or Quad O-A. We file Subpart W greenhouse gas reports. So we're subject potentially to the methane tax. We do our annual leak detection surveys and so forth. A few years ago, didn't even think about any of that. But for reasons that I'll talk about today, I spend probably a third of my time dealing with these regulations and requirements and trying to figure out how I mitigate our exposure to fines and penalties, but also the methane tax. That, by the way, let me just say right now, I think that's going to go away with the new administration. They're working on it right now. So hold your breath, keep your fingers crossed and so forth. So let me kind of set the groundwork for this. So about 7 months ago, Marathon Oil entered into a consent decree with the EPA, largest civil penalty in the history of air emission violation claims for stationary sources. So the total amount, as you can see, of the penalty plus the additional costs imposed to remediate things and for compliance was $241 million, so almost $250 million. 65 million or so of that was the civil penalty, which was the largest ever for air violation for stationary sources. Things like this over the last couple of years started getting my attention, and I started paying more and more attention to the requirements and the rules. It should get your attention too, if you operate. We've been very fortunate in Oklahoma. We haven't had the number of flyovers and the level of scrutiny that the Bakken and the Permian and other areas have received over the last couple of years. But the fines that were levied against Marathon for violations in the Bakken related to thief hatches that were open and emitting, to Nardo valves or pressure relief devices at the top of your tanks that they could fly over and see were emitting methane and VOCs when they probably should not have been. You should not see emissions from those valves during the ordinary course of business. They're intended to be, pressure relief, almost like emergency relief devices. They want to see all those emissions going routed to a flare or a vapor recovery unit or some type of combustion, enclosed combustion. That's not what happened here. And then they sent us what they call a Section 114. I've had to respond to a Section 114 request before. It's in legal parlance like discovery for the EPA. When we send interrogatories and requests for documents, they send what they call Section 114 requests, and they're a real pain, and they take time to respond to. But it's how they get additional information. If they fly over your facility in a helicopter, for example, which is what the EPA has used mainly the last couple of years, and they don't see any emissions, you don't have to worry about whether you've filed all your permits because most medium to smaller operators, I'm going to say 90% of them have not obtained all the air permits that they need, including construction permits, operating permits, and so forth. But if you can be the company that has a pretty clean facility from an air emission standpoint, and you don't have these emissions that are visible from the air, they will go by states in particular with the handheld OGIs and shoot your facility. But if you can keep a pretty clean location, that's your first line of defense. Make sure they fly over to the next guy, basically, and that they don't stop at you or they don't make a note on their GPS of you so they go back and find out who you were. So this should get all of our attention. The violations that were alleged against Marathon in this monumental case, that's very new, obviously settled 7 months ago, were mainly for violations of what we call Quad O and Quad O-A, which were rules that apply to wells that were drilled or tank batteries that were built, compressors that were installed and so forth from about the 2011 timeframe up through decade or so after that. So it was mainly older wells that were drilled under either Quad O or Quad O-A, not the new rule, not this Quad O-B rule that everybody's been hearing about. Quad O-B only applies to wells, tank batteries are constructed, wells that are drilled, compressor stations that are built, amine units that are installed, things that are installed after December 6th of 2022. So Marathon got caught under these old rules, not under the Quad OB. But the Quad OB rules that were enacted December of 23, so year and a half or so, year and a couple of months ago, merely expanded the Quad O and Quad OA rules. It includes things we're going to look at, a super emitter program, now requirements when you plug wells, brought in additional equipment that's subject to the little fugitive emission surveys that we do with OGI cameras or helicopters or airplanes or now satellites. So here is just a quick, I'm not going to get into much law. You can pause now that I'm not going to get into much of law today. You guys don't care so much about that. But you do need to know, here are the dates, the relevant dates, that the various EPA Quad O rules, as we call them, here's what they apply to. And these timeframes that you're looking at are timeframes when the well was drilled or the compressor station was installed or the tank battery was built. So you can see what rules they fall on. My point here is you don't have to know anything about all the different components of these rules. Just know that as you went from Quad O to Quad OA to now Quad OB, it gets much tougher. And the rules are much more expansive, okay? You don't have to be an expert. You got Jonathans of the world who are experts in this. They can help you guys. But just know that they basically, the new modified or reconstructed sources. So if you've got a tank battery that's 20 years old, but you installed on that battery side a new tank, or you expanded the capacity, or you had new throughput because you fracked a well on the location, that's now going to come under the new rules. Just keep that in mind. I'm not going to go into all the details on that, but there are ways that you can have old facilities come under the new rules, okay? If you modify them, if you enhance them, and so forth. If you think about it, it's if you do something that increases the emissions, okay? That's what the EPA is looking for, is the emissions that they can detect. Now, the big thing that you guys have probably heard about Quad OB is Quad OC. And why? Quad OB is an extension. It applies mainly to newer wells that are drilled in new, like I said, new tank batteries and so forth. Quad OC rule, once the states finish their implementation plans, and they've got about 2 years to work on this, all existing facilities, all wells, all tank batteries, all compression facilities, processing plants, everything will now be subject to rules that are almost identical to the Quad OB. They're very stringent. It takes you forever just to read the rules, and then you won't understand it. I'm a lawyer. I've read it probably 3 times. The whole stem to stern is 1,500 pages or so. The rule itself is not anything near that, but all the background, all the explanations, all the comments, and it's challenging to understand. But just know that if the new administration doesn't get rid of Quad OC, then as soon as the state has its say and prepares its implementation plan, that's going to have to be, according to the EPA, very close to supposedly mirror the Quad OB rules, and they actually issued presumptive or template rules for the state to use. It's like hint, hint, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, although they have some rules. But if you're going to try to comply, you need to adopt rules that are nearly identical to what we're using right now. So, Gentner Drummond, other states have sued the EPA, saying no, under the applicable rules that we'll look at in a second, we have the right to do what we want to regulate these. We get it that we have to comply with most of your standards and things, but we should have some flexibility. So the Quad OC is still up in the air. That will go to the Supreme Court eventually. So it's being litigated right now. Now, why, if these rules have been around so long, have some of you not ever heard about them? How many of you before this year had heard about Quad O? Not very, half of you haven't heard about it. That's no surprise. If you're a bigger operator, maybe you have, but if you're a smaller operator in the service industry, maybe you haven't. So what's the big deal? Why all of a sudden am I doing a talk like this that I've never done before, never thought I would be doing? It's because the Biden administration had this, and this is, you'll see who this quote comes from, had a relentless focus on rooting out methane emissions, finding them wherever they are and getting rid of them. Joe Biden was just really laser focused on that. Another reason why these issues have come to the forefront are because of huge advances. I don't mean small, I mean big advancements in leak detection technology. In those days, how many of you guys have used a sniffer before to go find leaks on your equipment? Try to find a little pipeline leak or leak in your gathering line or somewhere around your wellhead. Little old sniffer, and you got to be pretty close to it, right? You got to be about this close to Aaron if he's leaking methane. So, yeah. No further discussion on that. So now they have OGI cameras where these NGOs, these activists, these environmental activists can really go to your fence line and detect leaks. They don't have to trespass on your location. They can do it from a distance. They can fly a drone over you. The airspace is probably legal ground for them to fly over. That's kind of a burning issue right now, but can they fly over in a drone with a camera mounted? Maybe, but definitely the EPA is using helicopters. Companies use that either we or some of you would hire use Cessna 172s, and they attach the camera to a strut. These are optical gas imaging cameras. They're infrared because they see what we cannot see. You can walk by a tank battery and look at it and go, wow, that's a Charter Oak tank battery. It's beautiful, right, Joe? It's just beautiful. And then you can pull up an OGI camera and shoot it and maybe see leaks all over the place. And then you can put it down and go, it's beautiful again. You just can't see this without a camera. There are also, the satellites are using, for the most part, laser type technology. And so this is one of the reasons this is becoming a big deal. Another reason is because of the reason this Quad OB is becoming such a big issue, and we're all talking about it, is because of the frequency of the flyovers that are being done by the EPA these days. We've been somewhat exempt in Oklahoma so far, knock on wood. Hope that stays that way. And the other reason in combination with that is the consent when they do find somebody and they fly over and they see you, and if you're a super emitter, which isn't a lot of gas that's leaking, and they see you, that you are going to get a notice, I think, these days. The days of the slap on the hand or light consent decree of the go fix it, just don't let it happen again, I think that's gone. They've got too much pressure from the environmental activists and so forth, and others, to start enforcing, and so you're probably going to see a fine if that happens, and the magnitude of the fines, as you'll see in a minute, is significant. So this is just, you can't see this very well. I only put this on here so that you can kind of see the progression of the Quad O rules and the type of equipment that over the last decade, over the last 12 years, as the Quad O rules have been expanded. They started, for example, the EPA started just regulating at well sites completions. They wanted you guys to do green completions. Pneumatic controllers, you can't use those high bleed pneumatics anymore. You have to use either intermittent or low bleed type. And eventually they're going to want to get rid of all emissions from controllers. And they're essentially doing that with pneumatic pumps now. But you can kind of see that the equipment and the things that the EPA has regulated over time is they've adopted these additional Quad O rules. They're called Quad O, by the way, because when you look up in the Code of Federal Regulations and you look for the statute, and only a lawyer would do this, and it's kind of a cure for insomnia if you have insomnia, but they have the rules are broken down, there are a bunch of them, and all of a sudden you get to, this tells you how many error rules there are. When you get to O, and they start at A all the way to Z, then do it again, then they get to O, that's the Quad O rules that apply to the oil and gas industry. So this just shows you how these rules have been expanded over time. Now, you guys don't know, does anyone, I'll just ask, anybody know who this guy is up in the corner? This was Biden's climate advisor, Ali Zaidi. Or Zaidi, a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, at the COP conference, which is a big conference that the United Nations sponsors and everybody goes to and talks about climate change and what are we going to do about it. And he got up at that and talked about Biden's kind of relentless focus on wiping out methanes. He's where I get the title for this, because he said that the planned crackdown on methane is a part of Biden administration's relentless focus on making sure we root out emissions everywhere we can find them. Thought, that was an interesting quote, so I've used it. I've stolen it. But that's Ali Zaidi. He is no longer, as of this month, actually last month, I know this will come as a huge surprise to you guys, he is no longer the White House advisor on climate, okay? He's gone. So what was the administration's crackdown on methane to root out emissions? A lot of it was the adoption and implementation of just a whole host of rules. Biden issued a bunch of executive orders. Presidents have just realized now that that's the way to go, because Congress takes too long. So they'll issue an executive order. Most of them probably aren't enforceable because presidents can't make laws. They can only take laws, interpret them, and send an order to the agencies to implement those and how to implement them. But that hadn't been done. I think the presidents, the last few of them, think they have carte blanche authority. That's okay. They just duke it out in the courts and figure out if it's enforceable or not. But in the meantime, with respect to air emissions and this relentless focus that the prior administration had, they adopted these Quad O rules, Quad O, B, and C. The subpart W, where if you emit more than 25,000 metric tons of CO2e, so carbon dioxide equivalent, a year, and if you are like us and you have a lot of gas-fired compressors, we have about 30 of them, so we emit a lot of CO2, and so we are subject to the GHG reporting requirements and permitting and so forth. They expanded those rules, and in particular, they expanded them to make the calculations for your missions more accurate and reliable, and they use a lot of factors, emission factors, that they changed a lot of those, which was really kind of detrimental to us starting this year. But as you know, under the Inflation Reduction Act, this methane tax was adopted. They call it a waste emission charge. The terminology that's adopted to not call something what it really is amazing to me. But this methane tax, it's called this waste emission charge. I think, guys, that's going away. I hope it does, because I've run our calculations and I've done everything I can the last few years to get our methane and CO2 emissions down, and we still have exposure. But I think that it's going to go away because Senator Cruz, they're trying to use a Congressional Review Act to adopt a resolution to get rid of the methane tax. They also, what they're doing right now, and this is as of a few days ago, I just looked at his resolution, but on the methane tax, what they're really doing is they can't, through a resolution, attack the methane tax itself because it was passed by Congress, Section 136 of the Inflation Reduction Act. So Congress is working on that right now, and I understand maybe it'll get passed as a part of the budget reconciliation, but they're working on getting rid of the new rule that the EPA passed, Ted Cruz and his gang is. So we'll see what happens. I think there's hope there, but these are the things that have been passed. Even the BLM got into the act and adopted a bunch of new methane regulation rules. That's not really in their purview, that's really the EPA's, and so they got sued in Wyoming several years ago, and then North Dakota more recently, a judge issued an injunction that has suspended the effectiveness of that rule right now. So there's at least some hope that some of these rules will not survive the legal scrutiny. So another reason, like I said, that these rules have now come to the forefront, and we're talking about this today, is the number of flyovers is a little astonishing to me. This picture that you're seeing is the number of flyovers in a small area of the Permian back in 22. Look at how, and this was only over about a month time frame, and they did all these in a helicopter. That's typically the mode that the EPA has been using the last couple of years, has been using helicopter. So, and you have OGI cameras, like you see down on the lower right, that can detect leaks from a further distance with amazing clarity and specificity. And you have guys like a Bloomberg reporter who a little while back figured out how to tap into a database, a NASA database for one of their satellites, and get a picture of some methane plumes in the Permian, both in Texas and in New Mexico. The Texas side was patchy, and the New Mexico side was, and then Targa was on the Texas side of the Permian. So this guy, neither one of these companies had reported these leaks. And so this guy publishes them in Bloomberg, and the world gets to see it. And you can imagine that was a pretty unsettling wake-up call for the regulators in Texas and New Mexico. And so the companies had to explain why they didn't either detect these, or if they did detect them, why they didn't report them. But this is what we're faced with, these guys, young guys who know how to use computers and find stuff from satellites. Most of the cameras are, like I said, you can see the picture of one mounted on, I think this is a Cessna 172. And you can see they mount them on helicopters, struts of helicopters, or Cessnas, for example, or drones. I know Flogistics is here today. They've used a drone to scan some of our stuff before. And the thing that intrigues me the most by far, and I spend a lot of time on this, is the satellite technology. So Carbon Mapper is, you guys can go on this website, just look at carbonmapper.org and go to their data portal, and you can see their flyover reports. They use different satellites, but their main one now is collaboration with NASA. It's a Tanager satellite. It's been in orbit for a while, and they'll post stuff almost every week. So I'm trying to work on a way they don't say who the owner of the facility is, but they'll give you the coordinates. And you can go look at it on Google Maps. So you can find out if they saw you as a big leaker. They're looking for super emitters, 100 kilograms an hour or more. So 5 MCF an hour or more, 120 MCF a day leak or more. Those are big plumes. So you can go on Carbon Mapper, and guys, you can't see this, but these are like 2,000 leaks they detected in the Permian on the New Mexico side and the Texas side, okay? You can go see on the side, it'll give you, if you sort it this way chronologically. You can see Midland, Texas, another one in Texas, and you can see the size of the leaks they found. Like the one on the bottom, 226 kilograms an hour is a pretty good sized leak. I'm not gonna say it's huge, but it's a pretty good size leak. It's definitely a super emitter, remember, is 100 kilograms or more. Look at these, 2 of the 4 here. It looks like all 3 of the 4 are what they consider super emitters. We'll talk about that more in a second. You can zoom in and see the plume, the direction of the plume. You can see the history. You can pull down for this particular plume. You can look at the history. This one they flew over a few times in May and look at the leaks there were pretty good leaks each time they flew over. Here's the point, guys. So Carbon Mapper's been experimenting with this for a while. I've stayed in touch with them to ask them, when are you going to start, when are you going to apply to become a super emitter under the EPA's program? They've already done that for their airplane flyovers. They've told me they're getting close to making sure that these people who are going to report to the EPA are scared that if they identify Charter Oak, and it turns out Charter Oak wasn't a leaker, it was somebody else, and Joe's stock is traded publicly, and all of a sudden it took a nosedive because this came out publicly. A week or 2 later, you find out, whoops, mistake, the damage is done, right? So they're little, these are NGOs, they're nonprofits, they're a little worried about that kind of exposure. So these guys at Carbon Mapper won't identify the source of the leak. You're gonna have to figure that on your own by looking at the coordinates, or just, frankly, I just go look at Google. I can convert this, they have a button that you can look at this leak on Google Maps, and you can see pretty clearly if you know what your facilities look like. Like I said, I'm trying to figure out how to take this master database that the EPA uses and apply it to Carbon Mapper so it'll identify who the sources are, so I can see if they're ours or not, for example. This is MethaneSat. MethaneSat is owned by the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, out of Washington, D.C. I think the super emitter program under Quad OB was developed to accommodate them because they've been working on this satellite for quite a while. It's been in orbit now for several months. It was launched on one of Elon Musk's most recent launches. So it's been in orbit for a while, so they've been taking pictures. Again, I heard back from them a while ago because they still have not applied for super emitter qualification or certification, and neither has Carbon Mapper, but they're both working on it. So I'm giving you guys a heads up. No charge, no cost. They're not reporting these leaks to the EPA yet. But once they get certified with the EPA, the process is they will report to the EPA. The EPA will notify you. You'll have about 5 days to go see if it's your leak or tell them it's not you. And then if it is you, you've got about 15 or so to fix it. Go shoot it, make sure it's fixed, and then report to the EPA, and then say your prayers and hope that you don't get fined. On MethaneSats, what you're going to be able to do on there, if you go to their data portal, and just go to methanesat.org, go to the data portal, start getting used to it, get friendly with it. You can actually drill down to pretty good detail. This is back from October 23, and this is Methane Air. This was from their airplane, but they were using the camera that they put on the satellite, okay? They were testing it first with an airplane or a jet, actually, and then now it's on the satellite. Guys, that satellite goes around the Earth 14 or 15 times a day, every day, 365 days a year, and all it does, its sole purpose, unlike some of NASA's satellites, its sole purpose is to find methane leaks. That's it. So the days of hiding behind trees and stuff and way off in a remote area, not going to work anymore. They are going to see you. Now, you got time now, because like I said, neither MethaneSat or Carbon Mapper have been approved or even applied yet for super emitter certification. You have to get certified to be able to report these incidents to the EPA so that the EPA can act on them. So this one, by the way, if you go and you find this one, this is near Watonga. This is from a couple of years or so ago. That was near Watonga. That was a super emitter. By the way, that was a big leak. But you can drill down further. And the one thing that right now, what MethaneSat is doing, they have this incredible database that they spent years developing that has every operator of every facility around the world. You know, can you imagine how big that database is? I asked the guy who's doing some work for me right now. He's just working on Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas, and he said this is overwhelming for him, and he's a computer guy. It requires a lot of servers. So they'll post who it is, so they know that this one's either EnLink or it was Kennedy and Mitchell, and if I opened up, if they had like 2 beside Kennedy and Mitchell, that means there's 2 wells or 2 sources, and I can go see the name of the wells. That's how accurate these things are these days. So if you're an operator, you're gonna see your name on here in the future. The key is try to stay off of it, you know, try to find your leaks, and because this then becomes published, it just, nothing good results. So another reason why this is a big issue, and I was supposed to finish at 12:30, is that right? Got a little more time? Okay, I'll try to speed it up. Is because of the size of the finds, I'm not gonna go over these because I need to compress time a little here, but look at these are good operators with clean sights. When you go drive by them and you look at them, you go, wow, I wish my sights looked like this. They're just spotless. Then you bring up that camera and look at them and you'll see leaks out of an ardo valve. You'll see a flare that has smoke trailing off of it, okay? They don't like either one of those. They don't like thief hatches that are leaking. Big finds for really good operators the last couple of years. Here's just a list of what they're looking for. I can tell you, I've read almost, I think, every consent decree and every complaint that's been filed by the EPA the last couple of years. Here's the common theme, guys. They're flying over in helicopters, and what they're really nailing, those finds you saw, almost all of them were this. Tanks, your tank battery, and your flares, okay? So, your tank batteries, you need to, if you are an affected facility, if you have tested it and Jonathan or someone's looked at it for you and it emits more than 6 tons a year of VOCs or 20 tons a year of methane, it's an affected facility. You need to be, if it's a new well, fairly new well, last couple of years, you need to be routing any fumes off of those tanks to a flare or a combustor or vapor recovery unit, okay? Because if they see it's just going into the atmosphere, get ready to have your name added to that list that I just showed a minute ago, unfortunately. But this is just a lot of sources. Because of the expansion of the Quado rules, you can now see here all of the things they're looking at to look for leaks. This is a pretty comprehensive list, whether you're upstream, midstream, or even a little bit downstream. Let's see, what do these look like from the air? Let's see if, this is from the ground using an OGI camera. That's an ardo valve, a pressure relief device that's leaking, and apparently, because this is from the EPA site, apparently this is one that should not have been venting. In the ordinary course, it shouldn't have been. So what they say is your engineers, your production engineers, design the facilities, undersized them to where when you had vapors build up in the tanks, they can't handle all of them. So your ardo valve leaks, right? Or your thief hatch springs and leaks. So that's part of what they nailed Marathon on, under engineering the facilities from the get-go. Flares are big deals. This is what they can see with an OGI camera. See the smoke coming off of it? You can't see that very well sometimes without an OGI camera. It'll look like a clean burn, and it turns out it's not. It's got trailing smoke. They don't want to see trailing smoke because that means your combustion efficiency is not at 95% or better, so you're leaking methane, right? Among other things, leaking methane out of that. So that's, if you have flares, you've got to have what they call parametric modeling and monitoring on them. Your flare has to be lit all the time. You need to be doing monthly inspections. They call these method 22 inspections, where you make sure you look at it and you time it. You make sure you don't see smoke more than 1 minute every 15 minutes, okay? Make sure it's a clean burning flare, because they will nail you on that. Let's go to one more. This is a thief hatch that's leaking. I'm not going to show you that one. I want you to see this one as my last one, because I want you to see how clean this facility is. This is Earthstone in the Permian. See how clean that looks? You can't see any smoke. You can't see anything. Here's what it looks like flying over. And that's just the beginning. Hang on. I mean, a good facility, a good operator. This isn't an ardo valve or a pressure relief device. It looks like, no, I'm sorry, this one's a thief hatch that is leaking. So either pressured up a little or the seal's broken. I've had plenty of our seals break before. Make sure your seals work. Look at this flare. You didn't see that when they flew over before they turned on the OGI camera. Look at that. That is probably the furthest thing from a 95% combustion efficiency, which is what the rule says you have to be if your tank battery is an affected facility. Like I said, you can't see these with the naked eye. All I'm going to do is here say these rules all stem from the EPA rules, like the Quado rules, stem from the Clean Air Act, Section 111. For those that care anything about law, that's where this originates, and that's where it's bifurcated between Section 111B, which is where the EPA sets standards for all new sources, like they decided, we're going to start regulating pneumatics, let's say, several years ago. That's a new source. So their rule when they adopted under 111B applies to the effective date of that rule forward, but rules that are adopted by the state as directed by the EPA under Clean Air Act 111D are the ones that are going to catch all the existing sources. All of your old wells, all of my old wells, and I've got tons of them, old wells. So does this frighten me a little? That would be an understatement. So let's skip this and try to wrap this up. Other than to say you can go on the EPA's website, and what the EPA does when they adopt these rules, they identify the source of the emission. They looked at what they call the BSCR, the Best System for Emission Reduction. So they kind of look at things and they look at the cost and how effective is this, and then they say, okay, this works for a compressor site. I'm going to make you shoot it with a camera, quarterly, let's say, and I'm only going to allow certain emissions per cylinder. And I think it's Jonathan 3, something like that, 3 MCF an hour or something like that, maybe less. So they adopt these best system of emission reduction, and then they adopt a standard. And on tanks, for example, it's storage vessels. Here's what gets you qualified, or gets you your equipment deemed to be an affected source that's subject to these rules. If you emit more than 6 tons per year of VOCs, volatile organic compounds, or 20 tons per year of methane, okay, then you're subject to these rules. You've got to capture and route those emissions to a controlled device, which is defined as either going to be a flare, a combustor, or VRU. The closed vent system, you'll hear that term, write that down in your brain. That's the pipe that goes from your tanks over to your flares. They do not want to see that leak at all. You'll see a common theme in these consent decrees and these orders and these fines. The tank leaking and a leak in the closed vent system. It's not working properly. It's not designed properly. It's just leaking, the valves and stuff. So make sure that you have those surveyed and that they don't leak. Now, quickly, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to say the new Quad O rule, here's what it does. This is Quad O, B, and C. They expanded the equipment that's now covered by fugitive emission requirements. Fugitive emissions are your unintentional emissions, okay? Your intentional emissions are just emissions, like from pressure relief devices stuff, but those that leak from valves, things like that, thief hatches, those are fugitive emissions, and the list has been expanded as to what they want you to shoot, in some instances annually, and some semi-annually, some quarterly, to determine whether you have leaks. This again applies to all your wells under Quad O-B that were drilled or tank batteries installed after December 6, 2022. But when Quad O-C is adopted, all your old stuff comes in. In the meantime, remember that Quad O and Quad O-A apply to all facilities and wells drilled in the last decade, up to December 6 of 22. I'm not going to cover this because we're running out of time. I just want to say that they also determined that a bunch of these orphaned wells, or wells that you guys have that are just plugged right now, are actually leaking methane. So when you plug those wells, they want to see you send a plugging plan in to the administrator. I don't know how they're implementing this right now. Haven't been able to figure that out yet. But then they want you to shoot it with an OGI camera. When you finish plugging it, document that you did that. Even if you didn't submit your plugging plan to them, document that after you plugged it, you shot it and it didn't leak. And keep that documentation. There are companies like, I know a few in here that will do that for you. The super emitter program, I explained that. I'm thinking that it might go away. That's one of the major bones of contention for some of these congressmen and women and some of these states and in the lawsuits that have been filed by Oklahoma and others. This is one of the things they're attacking. They want the flare monitoring. They want you constantly monitoring your flares, like I said, and make sure that pilot lit stays lit and that you don't have trailing smoke. And they're eventually they're doing this right now under Quad O-B, starting to phase out flaring from associated gas. You guys know what the aerial pictures look like of the Bakken, where they were flaring so much it looked like Houston at night. So they're going to phase that out. And then on the pre-existing wells, they're going to want to start seeing more of that routed to combustors and flares. Your associated gas. What they really want to see us do is get it routed into a pipeline as soon as we can. If you do that, you're miles ahead if you can avoid flaring it. We talked about pneumatic controllers and pumps. We talked about storage tanks. Make sure you document this. Most environmental firms, we've got great environmental firms here, Rosa-Rock's here, and others, Logistics, that have great software that they'll document all your surveys that you do, and they'll document your leaks, and then they'll document when you fix them. You have to do that, guys. The rules very specifically and clearly spell that out. If you shoot all your facilities and you have leaks and you fixed them, but you didn't document it, just assume you never even fixed them or never even found them, because that's what the EPA will assume. You don't get to say, oh, I did that. I just forgot to write it down. I forgot to document it. You've got to document it, okay? Lastly, I'm not going to get into the methane tax other than to say it's I think, unconstitutional. The way I calculate the tax at $900 a ton for your methane emissions is about $18 an MCF. When I'm selling at $2.50 an MCF, an $18 tax seems a little unlawful a little unconstitutional to me. I don't care what you call it, a waste emission charge, a penalty, a tax or whatever, but it's being attacked enough right now from so many different angles, I don't think it's going to survive. So for those of you who might potentially be subject to a methane tax, that applies this year based on last year's emissions. So it's 2024 emissions, you write your check at the end of August this year. I'm waiting, holding my breath, saying my prayers that our Congress and others will get rid of this before it becomes effective. I think that, I don't have time to go into all the details other than to say, I think with the Trump administration, there's going to be less intense scrutiny about all the things I just talked about. That's the best way I can describe it. Less intense scrutiny. I don't think we'll see quite the number of flyovers. That's not cheap. I think the fines, these crazy, ridiculous high fines, hopefully will be mitigated, and that business will be easier for us and better for us this year. So I'm going to stop right there. Questions? Yes, Joe. He's got a list. And
I just have a question since I heard
yeah.
you.
Told to keep it. Joel will have some questions.
And Aaron's got some questions. Okay. Seems like we've read articles, and is this true or not, that we're not the largest emitter in the oil and gas industry of methane, and it's actually the livestock industry.
Right.
Cattle and hog farms. Are they being subjected to this type of scrutiny and taxation, et cetera?
The answer is yes and no. So I've seen some settlements, some consent decrees with some of the big ag producers and stuff for methane, but I haven't seen the number of consent decrees and the level of scrutiny that our industry receives. Everybody knows the answer to that, right? You're talking about ag versus oil and gas. What's the easiest target? Yeah, it's going to be us. With Trump, that's going to be different. It's going to be different, Joe. But yeah, they don't give them a complete hall pass. They're a target too, just not like we are.
Okay. I had a second question. It's kind of related in that. Okay, that huge fine that Marathon had, so much larger than the other fines, and you know, you can be fined $250 million. You know, you can go hire the best lawyers in the world. Why didn't they fight it and negotiate that down? I mean, they could tie that up for decades.
Yeah, you know, you'd have to talk to their executives because the legal department's not going to make that decision, right? And for whatever reason, they decided to cooperate some. Part of it was, Joe, the EPA alleged once they got the data responses back, all the data from their 114 request, the request for documents and the request for just interrogatories, basically. That's what it is. And they saw that they believed, at least they alleged, that Marathon deliberately undersized its facilities, deliberately underestimated throughput after the wells were completed so that they didn't have to get some of their Title V type permits and things like that. I'm skeptical about that. I mean, why would someone deliberately I mean, I get it if you can't estimate with accuracy what the well's going to make. And so when you engineer it, maybe you undersize it a little bit. And probably if that happens, the best thing to do for us guys is if you go out there and you see consistently your auto valves are leaking, you're undersized, something's going on, you're not handling the pressure from the tanks the way you should be routed over to flare if it's a tank that's an affected source. So probably ought to fix it, and they apparently didn't because they have a pretty long list. You can go look at the consent decree and you can see all the wells and tank batteries and everything they're covered. And so I think theirs was a little different because of the type of allegations, but a lot of the allegations were made for violations of Quad O and Quad O and Quad O-A, which means if they were newer wells, they would have the same violations under Quad O-B because Quad O-B only brings in more equipment. So their violations were all tank batteries, flares, and a lot of the engineering. How many engineers in here? Hint, if you're production engineer in the future, don't undersize your takeaway. That's what's happened to some of them. That's why these auto valves are leaking. So yeah, good question. What else? Aaron, did you have something?
I mean, I do have a question. So can you talk on AVO a little bit? So my understanding AVO was kind of like an aspect of like you have your pumper or somebody go out there and kind of do an inspection that wouldn't actually require an ODI or ClearCam or something else go out there. So
yeah, so
is that actually going to prevent it? I mean,
yeah, so that's the AVO requirements you can see right here for fugitive emissions from well sites with major equipment. You have to do bi-monthly AVO surveys, and then you have to also do periodic camera surveys. The camera surveys will detect your leaks. I mean, they don't miss very many. It's usually operator error if something's missed. The AVO is audio, visual, olfactory. So it's your sight, your hearing, and your smell, not your taste. But so an AVO is, hey, we want the industry to, Aaron, get your pumpers trained up or get an environmental firm to help you, but get them trained up, in this case for this type of equipment, every other month to go out there, and they have to document it, that I went out and I looked at the valves, I looked at the thief hatches, I looked at everything, nothing was leaking based on what I saw, what I smelled, and what I heard. I didn't hear any hissing, for example, right? which you would hear some of that sometimes. So it was a compromise to get them to back off some on the frequency of the OGI camera work. It's still fairly frequent, and so they allow us to go do visual and audio inspections periodically. Now, for example, if I were to go back here and look at just, let me see if I can find it. Well, I'm going to just say well sites that are wellhead only, no tank battery, just wellhead only, nothing else on the pad, no separators and things like that. All you have to do is AVO. You don't have to do any OGI, right? Jonathan's going, yeah, maybe, Jay, I need to fact check you on that. But yeah, that one is one where they let us just do AVOs, because frankly, there's not much that can leak, right? But if you have tank batteries and stuff, you're going to have to do a combination of AVOs and OGI. Good. Yeah, yes?
The schedule of the flyovers booking months
I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm sorry to keep you guys later, but hopefully you're learning something. But yeah, so there is, I know one company that I've talked to in the past where in the Permian, one of the things these guys do is they go look at the manifest or whatever, the schedule at the local airports. They figure out what helicopter the EPA is using, or if they're using a Cessna or something, which one it is, and they'll publish it, the schedule, that week. I don't know if they're still doing that. I'm sure because usually the state of New Mexico, for example, collaborates with the EPA when they go do your inspections. You usually have state inspectors and the feds, the EPA on the plane or whatever, collaborating. Texas is not so collaborative, as you can imagine. Oklahoma, not so much either, I don't think. But yeah, interesting you say that, because, I mean, necessity is the mother of invention, and someone's already thought of that.
We could put a little tinfoil hat over all.
Yeah.
So if your owner or whatever is on location and a drone flies over,
Yeah.
not a man operated,
Right.
kind of like that TV commercial.
Shoot it down? Yeah.
I mean, is it legal to pop it down?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I think we're going to know sometime soon, because people are starting to do that. Literally have a shotgun on location, and if you see a drone come, I mean, part of it, you don't want, are they really looking for your leaks, or are they looking for proprietary information while you're drilling, for example? Felony? Is it? To shoot the drone? Oh. Like I said, you can do it, just know there may be consequences. So, what else? Anything else? Yes, Jonathan? Yeah, hey, fill in any blanks for me, by the way.
I think, Jay, first of all, great presentation. It's a lot of material, and really appreciate you kind of walking through some of this. Being in the business, whether we agree with all of the rules that come down from the federal government or not, I'll tell you, I don't really necessarily agree with everything for sure, and there's definitely government overreach. But not really an environmental question, but more of a legal question. What's your best advice as far as mitigating your risk? As far as a lot of these rules are now in place today, we're hopeful that Trump
Right.
change some things, but nobody has a crystal ball to know when and how and if it's going to happen or will it happen. So how do you best mitigate your risk?
So,
What should you do in that?
I've had that question asked several times, and I've always given the same answer. I think maybe you've heard me in a presentation before use this, and that is hire somebody to go shoot your facilities as your first line of defense. I think I've mentioned that. And the reason I say that is just because of what I've seen, how the EPA is behaving and how they're catching people and using helicopters and stuff. So for me, the answer to that, to mitigate my risk, is what I've done. You guys do work for us. Logistics has done work on some of our facilities. We shoot everything, and I try to find leaks, first of all, and get them fixed quickly. Because I know that if I'm next door to Joe, for example, and I'm picking on Joe today because he's an easy target, and I've got I've shot mine, I've repaired everything, I've got it fixed, and the EPA flies over, but Joe hasn't done that, I'm not going to get a request, or they're not going to pursue me, and I may not have all my I's dotted or T's crossed. I mean, I may not have all my permits. There are gazillion permits to get that Jonathan and others like that can help you and do a great job. But I don't have to worry about that, because they're going to go after Joe. And I hate to throw Joe under the bus. He should have done his surveys, right? So that's my best answer. And for me, Jonathan, when I mitigate my methane leaks, I also, first of all, I do the right thing. I'm not totally opposed to all these rules. I think we should do a better job of minimizing our leaks and finding them and repairing them. I think we've got to do a better job of that. And when I do that, I minimize my exposure to methane tax, because I am exposed. Probably maybe only half of you here have exposure to the methane tax, and the other half don't really know, because you don't really know much about it. But so that's, and then I think I've said this before, and kudos to guys like you, Jonathan. Get you a good environmental consultant. If you're smaller and you haven't done that, instead of putting your head in the sand, and saying this is too overwhelming, source it out. It's going to cost you some, but it's not going to break the bank. But those guys are experts in this. I'm not the expert. It may sound like I know a lot about this, but we just scratched the surface today. And so those are the two things. Get your environmental consultant. And I don't know if that was, you can pay me later for that, by the way. And shoot your facilities. Yeah, I have shot facilities that didn't have to be shot because I wanted to find my leaks, and I think I mentioned this, and I wanted to get, every time you're venting an MCF into the atmosphere, you just lost about $3, right? Or after royalty, maybe $2 or so. Anyway, okay, good question. Yes?
One more question.
Yeah, Jeff, I was going to ask you, are any of the satellite companies, have any of those been approved by or teamed up with EPA yet, or is that just
No, like I said, that's a great question. And by the way, there are a lot of satellite companies, not a lot, but there's several who work for the industry. And, will shoot your facilities using planes, for example, and they do a good job. But, the guys that do with handhelds and drones, a bunch of good environmental firms around that do that kind of work. The two biggies that I thought would already have their application submitted to the EPA for approval as a super emitter reporter are Carbon Mapper and EDF, or Methane SAT is what it's called, but it's the Environmental Defense Fund. They are exceedingly well funded by some of the wealthiest people you guys know. Carbon Mapper is collaborating with NASA, so need I say more? I mean, they all have these almost empty pockets. But what both of them told me is that they're vetting, they're going around 14 times a day right now. They're busy vetting the data they get and making sure that they can accurately determine the leak rate, given things like temperature and wind direction and flow and stuff. They're making sure they're as accurate as possible before they start releasing this publicly, whether they're like Carbon Mapper, and Carbon Mapper is not, as far as I'm not going to identify any of you guys or me. You got to do it on your own. But they're going to somehow turn over that data to the EPA. I don't know how, because the rule says they have to identify the facility owner if they know it. So maybe they're just going, oh, well, we don't know. We don't look, don't see, don't tell. When Methane SAT starts publishing their data, I think you're going to start seeing a bunch of it. If you guys start monitoring their website, I think probably starting another month or so, they're at least a month or two behind right now vetting the data they've captured over the last several months, few months since the satellite's been in orbit. I think once you start seeing that, you're going to see, like I showed, you're going to see you, me, others we know identified within, Jonathan, 500 meters or something like that, I think is what, of the identified leak source. And that includes the pipelines, processing plants, and operators like us. So, yeah. Anything else? Kept you way too long, but thanks for your patience.